Dynamic information technologies, shifting trends in historical and cultural scholarship, the burgeoning community archives movement, and I was talking about that earlier in the week to some others here, the push for open data and human rights and social justice concerns have all presented compelling challenges for archives to reconceptualize and respond over the past few decades. However, as important a factor as each of these is in its own right, intertwined with each in various ways, is the phenomenon that arguably presents the greatest impetus of all for archival reconceptualization and technological development, and that is the networked society. Today, and I'm going to draw on some of the work that I've been doing recently, I intend to focus on the particular implications of the network society for the delineation, creation, and evaluation of the record. And here I'm thinking both in terms of the bureaucratic record, but also the human cultural record, as well as the ways in which the record may be mined, forensically analyzed, cross-compiled, and otherwise searched or mapped to the detriment or benefit, hopefully the benefit, of organizational, scholarly, community, and personal interests. In responding, archives, once and for all, will have to move beyond a custodial and institutional mindset that, for many, has dominated the field for centuries, and instead embrace a network orientation. To implement this orientation, however, research is needed into the design of metadata structures and archival information storage and retrieval systems, what I'm going to refer to as archival IR, that can exploit the networked creation and uses of records and other forms of primary data and respond to and protect against the potential vulnerabilities, particularly those relating to privacy and security, and also the social ability to forget, that may be exposed. I'm first going to review some of the emerging conceptualizations of how records exist or might exist in a networked context. I'm then going to use a prominent social media example for the rest of my talk to illustrate some of the challenges that born networked materials pose for current archival thinking and practices, and to contemplate the considerations that they raise and the ways in which they push us to contemplate new research and development in archival IR. And I think at the end, I'm also going to point out a few ways in which such implementation and reorientation of IR in the archival context might in turn offer some fertile areas of expansion to thinking in the broader field of IR itself. So first I want to start with a little bit of background. Archives are involved in networking just like everybody else. It is a part of archival life. Local and regional archival repositories are often a part of a national state archives network. If we thought about corporate archives for multinational bodies, a single archive might be physically distributed across many locations of a parent company. Sometimes archives belong to archival consortia, but on the whole, they are still conceived and behave as standalone entities in terms of their practical implementations and their holdings. Archival descriptive systems have been networked since the 1980s and the 1990s, first through bibliographic utilities and then through the web. And the exchange of descriptive metadata has been facilitated by development of national and international descriptor standards, and more recently, through linked data and the semantic web. And of course, many archives have at least experimented with some kind of collaborative strategy for creating and/or collecting documentation of particular phenomena, or for developing joint virtual exhibitions. Nevertheless, much of the canon of archival ideas and their implementation in practice remain firmly rooted in non-network thinking. For those of you who may not be very familiar with archives, the roots of this can be traced back to some very fundamental ideas in archival science that reflect historical, standalone bureaucratic structures and notions of authority. Among the most fundamental are the following: that an institutional archives should be responsible solely or primarily for the records of its own parent bureaucracy, that those records should be physically and intellectually retained and collectively described according to the entity that generated them, that is, their official provenance, and that that entity is usually conceptualized as a single organization, authority, office, function, or individual, albeit one that may take on many different forms or names as its historical role unfolds. But of course, little of this reflects the reality of bureaucratic records creation today, and certainly not of the broader cultural record as it is being digitally created, transmitted, linked, and curated outside the auspices of the mainstream archival profession. For many years, archivists have been focused on the management of born digital, what archivists refer to as electronic records, and they've developed models and technologies and protocols for the capture, ingest, preservation, and description of those materials. Although notably, there's been considerably less emphasis on the searching and retrieval of the archived electronic record. More recently, archivists have been seeking to apply or extend these approaches to record storage and records management in the cloud. However, we also know that the current paradigm for records management fails to grapple successfully with the born networked electronic records and with associated questions that arise in the networking world about what is an archival record, what is its metadata, when is it created, where is it located, and to whom does it belong? Indeed, we can identify many new post-physical ways to conceive of how and when the record is manifested in a networked environment. Many of these move far beyond current sort of bureaucratic constructions of record and look at a much more social nature of the record. For example, we could conceive of the record in the following ways. First of all, the metadata record. Electronic records management research has demonstrated the ways in which digital records are a composite of both content and their contextual metadata that accumulates over the life of that record. This might have seemed to be a somewhat academic conceptualization until recently. However, the scandals that erupted as a result of disclosures about US National Security Agency and other governments intercepting mobile phone communications have surfaced some very interesting questions regarding networked records and mobile telephony about what comprises a record. A record in the context of digital telecommunications has often been equated to the content of a text message or a phone call, and that component may be legally protected. What comprises the metadata for that text message or phone call, which is often equated to everything about a person's phone calls or messages that is not the content. For example, patterns of calling, duration of calls, routing over cell networks at the destination of calls or messages, may not be recognized as part of the same record and may not be subject to the same legal protections. Indeed, such metadata, which is often distributed across many different parts and places of a communications network, is currently being exploited by intelligence and security agencies that argue that it is not a record in its own right, or even a protected part of the content that is recognized as a record. A second possible construction is the multi-provenance bureaucratic record, and also the record that's created by the crowd. Many archival scholars in recent years have pointed out that the dominant conceptualization of provenance fails to acknowledge the complex of parties that are often responsible for or participate in the creation of a record. They point out that this perpetuates existing bureaucratic power structures and elites and renders others who participate in the production of the record as mere subjects rather than co-creators who might have rights in those records. Despite such acknowledgement of the oversimplification of provenance, both historically and today, and the kinds of human consequences it has, the descriptive standards community has resisted building more complexity into their ideas about provenance within descriptive standards. And of course, current information retrieval is highly dependent on the way that provenance is constructed as an access point. Provenance is quite simply considered to be just too important a primary access point to make it that complex. However, born-networked multi-provenantial records, such as those that are generated by organizational or scientific research collaborations, if we were thinking about official or bureaucratic records, or within large-scale social media environments created by the crowd, make it impossible to continue to ignore this issue, no matter how problematic it might be for archival descriptive practices. In terms of how and where that record is created and managed and under whose auspices, we could come up with some other conceptualizations of the networked record. One might be the extra-institutional record, for example, the record that is stored in a commercial cloud, onshore or offshore, often on the same servers as records that are created by other organizations and individuals, and potentially subject to multiple jurisdictional and security claims. If we think again about the record that's being created by mobile telephony, although senders and recipients can see the record on their own devices, they're not readily empowered to archive it because the phone systems aren't set up that way. And archives are even less empowered to capture the content of mobile phone-generated records. Moreover, copies of the record or its metadata that have been transmitted over networks are often being captured and being stored by telecommunications providers who themselves may be subject to various legal requirements from their own states about how long those copies must be kept and whether they must be opened upon demand to a government's security agencies. Another example might be the trans-institutional or trans-jurisdictional record, examples of which might be the kinds of records that are generated through various types of collaboration within and across private and public sector interests. Government, corporate, and scholarly activities are among those that regularly create records in this way. And of course, users like academics like myself may often be using cloud services like Dropbox to help with those collaborations. Often to find that the records that are created through such collaborations become orphaned at the end of the collaboration because there's no designated archival authority that is responsible for archiving such networked trans-institutional activities. Sometimes records that end up being saved by individual collaborators might end up in the institutional archive to which that collaborator is affiliated or with which that collaborator is affiliated, and thus a record of the collaboration might end up in an ad hoc way distributed across multiple institutional repositories, but often without any coordinated effort to bring it together. Moreover, such records may be subject to competing ownership and access claims because of the different legal jurisdictions and private and public institutions involved with their creation and storage. And one other conceptualization might be what I would call the mobile or the itinerant record. This is the record that isn't tethered to where you are and when you are working. You create it everywhere you go, you carry it with you, and you may have a certain amount of discretion over whether or not it gets archived. For example, the contents of your mobile phone or what your mobile phone creates, texts, calling records, photographs and video, and social media interactions, all stored somewhere on a network, but not under substantive archival control often. And finally, we could consider alternative conceptualizations in terms of how a record might be discerned, evaluated, and used when its existence is not immediately apparent. And here is where we see some of the real potential, as well, perhaps, as a threat of a networked approach. And I'll give you three related examples that go from some fairly obvious and concrete to something that is maybe a little bit less obvious. The first is what I've been calling the stitched together record. We could also perhaps call this the distributed or the diasporic record, or even we could refer to it as a virtual archive of traces. Very different parties are interested in this phenomenon. For example, and this is historically true as well as true in a networked world, scholars who trace the roots of diasporic and migratory populations or individuals are interested in the traces that those people leave behind that might show up in historical immigration records, passenger lists, boarding house registers, and aid agency reports, newspaper, business advertisements that have been now, today, digitized or digitally described by various archives and put online. And they want to try to pull this together. Another example that is very similar and yet very dissimilar at the same time might be national security agencies that are trying to track the movements of individuals suspected of being involved in terrorist activity, whether that be through active mobile phone records and their metadata, or through current immigration records, plane, boat, passenger lists, hotel registrations, and so forth. And yet another example might be to support the documentary needs of refugees or other kinds of emigrants and migrant workers who may pass through many points of documentation around the world as they move, and who have need of gathering these records together to establish their rights, their residency, and so forth. These kinds of examples illustrate why so many people are interested in linking together documentary traces that can provide a bigger picture than any single archive or its descriptive systems currently can present. There are many ways in which this stitching together could be done beyond what is presently capable, by exploiting a record's metadata across its life, by working with the granularity of born digital records, by using different pattern matching and inferencing techniques. And these have a variety of implications, obviously, for scholarship and for some of these other kinds of uses, but they also have implications for personal privacy and for national security. And if we're going to research new kinds of information retrieval techniques, we have to research these implications in concert with those. The mined or mapped or compiled record is similar to this. This is, I think, what I would call a latent record, one that can be actualized by pulling together different threads within a corpus of records or across multiple corpora in order to draw a picture of an individual or an event, or to detect patterns that would be impossible to discern from individual records or corpora. And the final example, which is the one that is perhaps the most abstract one, is what I would call the implied or the inferred record. It's another kind of latent record, but maybe a more difficult one to grasp. This is the record that is present through its absence. It is the record that a scholar, a genealogist, a plaintiff, or a survivor might wish were there, but just isn't. But depending upon the robustness of the other material in the corpora, one might infer that it was originally there and for some reason has not been kept, or that it should have been created, but actually it never was. This is one of the areas where archival applications of IR might contribute something back to the parent field of IR, which historically has been focused on achieving a match between what is sought by a user and what is known to exist in the corpus. And often, of course, archival users want to find what was not already known. In this case, the user may be interested in using IR techniques to establish what does not exist in the corpus in order to make inferences about why it is not there. Given such scenarios, I would argue that archivists need to accept that they are increasingly unable, and indeed probably in the future will not be able to afford to, continue to exercise control over the circumstances of creation or production of networked records. As a result, both records management activities, such as records retention, scheduling, and appraisal, that is the act of selecting what will be archived and what will be disposed of, are going to be struggling, and indeed might even become obsolete. Digital forensics has clearly demonstrated that we are unable to eliminate all traces of a digital record and its linkages, particularly one that has moved across networks through the processes of appraisal and disposition. If we still want to get rid of some aspects of that record, it's also increasingly difficult to discern in a series of very granular communications and other digital traces what actually, intellectually, physically, and at a realistic economic cost we might eliminate. Moreover, archivists and individual physical repositories may find that they will never be in a position to take physical custody or even legal ownership of the networked record that they are nevertheless being expected to curate. Such curation will involve virtual capture and preservation, and then ensuring the capacity to retrieve, construct, or reconstruct what will be a profoundly networked and vastly more extensive, but hopefully more inclusive record. The harbinger today of these phenomena are attempts to archive social media. And although many archivists might not consider that there is much of value in some of the social media with which they are familiar, and this is actually a very debatable point, and I will discuss this more in a minute, there is no doubt that how individuals in their business as well as in their personal capacities are using network communications, such as mobile phones, increasingly involves using social media type applications or incorporating characteristics thereof. Thus, looking at these archiving attempts provides us with some useful indicators for what we might expect from other, more traditional applications of records in the very near future. So, to help us to imagine the dimensions of these challenges for archives today and into the future, I want to describe a social media case that may be familiar to many of you, but maybe not in the details I'm going to give you. In 2010, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. entered into a controversial partnership with Twitter and the commercial social data provider GNIP to build and preserve an archive of tweets. So let me say, first of all, that the Library of Congress is not an archive per se. It is a research library. It's, in fact, the largest research library in the world. It has very extensive special collections, and it has also been involved for many years, like many other national libraries, in archiving the web. It took on Twitter in part because the National Archives of the United States is not authorized to work with anything other than US federal records created by the executive branch of the federal government. The Library of Congress is also not taking over ownership of the Twitter archive. That still belongs to Twitter. In 2013, the Library of Congress justified its decision to preserve or archive the Twitter archive as follows. Here's what it said. As society turns to social media as a primary method of communication and creative expression, social media is supplementing and in some cases supplanting letters, journals, serial publications, and other sources routinely collected by research libraries. Archiving and preserving outlets such as Twitter will enable future researchers access to a fuller picture of today's cultural norms, dialogue, trends, and events to inform scholarship, the legislative process, new works of authorship, education, and other purposes. So in other words, the library was arguing that social media can capture a more complete archive of certain facets of society than was ever previously possible. Indeed, filling in the blanks of what archives historically have either not chosen to acquire at all or have selectively weeded out. As of January 2013, the Twitter archive had completed retrospective accessioning of public tweets from Twitter's founding in 2006 up to 2010, and was digitally ingesting the tweets that had been sent each day subsequent to 2010. And in January 2013, they said that those tweets were accumulating at the rate of 500 million a day and growing. So vast amounts of material. That Twitter feed is acquired in real time. That is, without any lag time between tweeting and ingestion into the archive. And although this may be necessary in order to ensure that tweets are captured, and this is a familiar tactic to archivists trying to work with electronic records, it certainly raises new questions about privacy and the value of hindsight, that the traditional lags that often existed in archives between when material was created and when it was actually transferred to the archives often help to mediate. The Twitter archive is also being acquired without going through any kind of appraisal process. That is, there is no selection mechanism being used, for example, to identify only tweets associated in some way with America, which in fact is the collecting mission of the Library of Congress. So everybody's tweets are being ingested, or to impose any kind of archival value judgment on the continuing value of the tweets. They're also ingesting deleted tweets as well. So people who tweet and then delete their tweets have no ability not to have the deleted tweets go into the archive. The Library of Congress argues that it is clear that technology to allow for scholarship access to large data sets is lagging behind technology for creating and distributing such data. Even the private sector has not yet implemented cost-effective commercial solutions because of the complexity and resource requirements of such a task. To encourage such development of information retrieval capabilities and to address the impossibility of manually describing the contents of such a huge archive, data mining rather than archival description of the Twitter archive is being conducted by GNIP. While this data-centric approach offers the possibilities of being able to do many new things with the contents of the archive, something perhaps is also being lost. Manually created archival description traditionally would bring a value-added component to dissemination and retrieval processes that would include incorporating a broader contextualization of content and also taking measures to protect sensitive content or the interests of individuals mentioned in the content who might in some way be vulnerable. The Twitter archive is also being made available to other commercial parties, such as financial services providers, marketing companies, and social monitoring and analytics firms, to mine, to use for predictive modeling, and to extend with additional services and capabilities. So this is really quite interesting because the Library of Congress is probably one of the best funded of all research libraries or archives anywhere in the world. And yet the Library of Congress needs to look to alternative funding sources and alternative information retrieval models to support this form of archiving. Turning to the private sector, as they argue, may also encourage innovation that is unlikely to occur within the archive. But at the same time, it commodifies both the content and the access to it. And again, to remind you, it's not just American content, it's content from all over the world that is being treated in this way, and the people's identities that are attached to it. And it brings new kinds of interests and incentives into play. It does bring and create an unparalleled testbed for software development, and that's something that archives have badly needed. It is one of the reasons why we haven't had very much archival IR research done in the field. But on the other hand, the resulting algorithms and other techniques may be proprietary and thus not available for not-for-profit implementation or expansion. On top of that, there hasn't yet been any free public access granted to the Twitter archive. So there are a lot of commercial interests who've got access to this content. You can pay to get access to this content, but there is not there's not free public access at the moment. So the Library of Congress Twitter-GNIP partnership arguably suggests the dawn of a new kind of archival access model. GNIP is currently the only third-party developer that has access to all the firehose data from Twitter. Other vendors, clients, and a growing corpus of researchers who are interested in investigating social media patterns and communications patterns and implications have to pay for access to tweet metadata using GNIP's tools and algorithms, or ping the Public Application Programming Interface, the API, and hope for the best, a situation where access costs and availability of accumulated data not only limit such research, but they also limit the replicability of its results and the testing of findings over time. The Twitter archive, not surprisingly, has received considerable media attention in terms of the strategies that are being employed by the Library of Congress and its partners, as well as the amount of public money that has been used to preserve the content of a form of networked communication that is seen by some to be primarily trivial or overhyped in terms of its influence, and yet, at the same time, is being enthusiastically promoted by others as a revolutionary tool capable of supporting private speech, citizen journalism, community organizing, and tracking world events, such as elections, military conflicts, and pandemics. Either way, as any archivist will tell you, it may be several years before its import can really begin to be understood. Such an example challenges archives to respond more proactively to the ways in which documentation is being created and might be used in the digital networked world, lest they cede their role as preservers and providers of essential recorded evidence to others, in this case, both libraries and commercial parties, who are more technologically innovative. Twitter is one of the most prominent examples of how and how fast ever-evolving forms of network communication have transformed not only the ways and scale at which humans communicate with each other, but also the milieu in which they do so and the influence they can exert. The future of these communications appears today to be bound up with social media platforms and mobile operating systems like Android and Apple that support messaging, combining instant messaging, texting, and electronic mail, and engaging multiple stakeholders, as well as new pricing and market structures and protocols and standards. While there is debate on just how valuable the Twitter archive will turn out to be, and also about the wisdom of acquiring social media through such a firehose approach, and with little clarity about how, if ever, widespread access might be supported, there is no doubt that embedded in other forms of network communication, such as email, interactive web pages, text messaging, Skype sessions and blogs, is evidence in the form of the traces of and reflections on contemporary decision-making, reporting, conversations, other kinds of social and cultural activities. Previously, such traces and reflections, as the Library of Congress argued, would have been contained in the formal and informal correspondence, reports, diaries, and notes that today fill the shelves of archives and provide some of our richest insights into these activities. That is not to say that direct equivalencies can be drawn between the communications media of today and those previously in terms of how they are used and by whom, but rather to argue that much of what we are likely to value most as future historical documentation of organizational and personal activities and decision-making is increasingly distributed across a web of interdependent and otherwise linked digital documents. Even though the Library of Congress sees itself as addressing a set of data rather than evidence management concerns, so there's a very different perspective between the library and archives, keeping everything and relying upon computational processing to manage archive tweets and make them discoverable or compilable is a strategy that supports the capture and representation of a record in the sense that it's being used by the Library of Congress, that is not static or isolatable, but it is rather continuously accumulating and evolving. And this is, in fact, an approach that was advocated to archivists as long ago as 1991 by David Bierman, who was a very well-known consultant in archives and museum informatics, as well as by some prominent information scientists. It wasn't taken up by archivists at the time, but today it is very much in keeping with Australian records continuum ideas about the dynamic and interactive nature of record keeping and use. In line with methods used in social network analysis, as already mentioned, this computational approach also offers new capabilities to end users that were not possible when working in a physical paradigm. So, for example, with the Twitter archive, things like following threads, trails, and patterns of tweeters with particular personal profiles, following tweets and retweets, identifying dispersion rates for events and other phenomena discussed in tweets, and potentially visually mapping these by date, geography, or influential tweeters, or correlating them with other digital traces of particular events. One wonders whether, if there were more investment by and expertise within archives to develop their own access tools and algorithms, such commercial fee-based approaches as evidenced by the Twitter archive and the limitations to use that can result might be averted. So what should archivists be doing? Information retrieval, or IR, is the name that has been used since the 1950s to refer to an interdisciplinary field of inquiry that draws its methods from computer science, library and information science, linguistics, statistics, and psychology. Researchers in IR seek to improve our understanding of the ways in which people can find, among large quantities of resources that contain information, broadly defined, resources of the particular kinds that they want. Of course, archivists are generally not interested in information broadly defined. They're interested in evidence, much more narrowly construed. The notion of, or need for, archival IR, that is, the adoption and adaptation of IR concepts and techniques to address specific archival and record-keeping needs and problems, remains substantively unaddressed within archival science. Indeed, the archival field is almost in the direct inverse of the situation in which information retrieval, the parent field, finds itself. There's been a lot of theorizing, a small amount of modeling and rules production, and an even smaller amount of actual systems development. And some of that has to do with the costs involved, some of it has to do with the expertise involved, and some of it has to do with the difficulties of using archival testbeds. It remains unknown which aspects of traditional IR might actually transfer into archival science and its evidence needs. And IR and systems design, which are cumulative by nature, at the moment don't have an archival track record to build upon. And yet, systems development research would seem to be absolutely essential if archivists are to work with networked documentation. And it seems also obvious that if archivists continue to choose not to engage with this kind of work, that there are going to be plenty of other communities who are desirous to do so, and they may not have the same sensibilities or interests as archivists. While the Twitter example clearly illustrates why automated retrieval from an extensive corpus of born networked materials may be the only way to find material, and also illustrates some of the new ways in which such a corpus might be mined and content stitched together, I just want to end with just a few remarks about some of the areas where I think this research should focus, at least to draw that out of what I've already said. Archivists may indeed have to relinquish the role of appraisal, their traditional role of appraisal, in the face of the way that network material is being created and the volume of the material. Traditional appraisal, to a certain extent, was about reducing bulk because we knew we physically couldn't store everything. Now we do have ways that we can store everything. But there were other functions that were traditionally a part of appraisal that perhaps now we could transfer to the IR side of things. For example, ensuring that information relating to personal privacy or corporate or national security is not accidentally exposed. Thinking about the societal function of forgetting and how that might be built into what is not exposed through IR. And also, of course, making sure that the records that are retained are useful and usable, and, as I have mentioned, usable perhaps in a lot of new ways as well. If we could leave the corpus intact, i.e. ingest without appraisal these kinds of materials, but apply archival principles through the clever exploitation of metadata that is created throughout the life of the record and records creation and record keeping processes, and in the design of archival storage and retrieval systems, perhaps we could retain a record that is richer in social detail than anything previously retained by archives or indeed by humanity. But one hopes at the same time build in safeguards against inappropriate exploitation. And just as a final note, if I can get it to move forward, there are some benefits perhaps back to the greater IR field in bringing archivists into this conversation. Potential advances in archival IR might include such things as helping users to find previously unknown, possibly what we would call smoking gun documents, documents that are, turn out to be particularly filled with revelations, as opposed to looking for known documents, exploiting multiple types and sources of metadata across the life of records. And these are the kinds of applications that perhaps there are other domains that would be really interested in these, in legal work, in litigation support systems, in news retrieval, in audiovisual archives, in data mining, and maybe this means working more closely with commercial data miner developers, and also in digital asset management. Thank you.